Hey guys, welcome to the season 2 of GirlUp Mukti Podcast. We are your host, Tushang Bhardwaj.
And Michelle Singh Olak.
We are the inner voice that tells your story,
Our story.
So Michelle, are you excited to kickstart this new session of Mukti's podcast?
Absolutely, Toshang. This season will be packed with some amazing and insightful sessions for all of you.
To kickstart with our new season, we have a lovely and ambitious executive board with us. So stay tuned and enjoy the show. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of GirlUp Mukti Podcast. This is Tushang Bhardwaj, your host for the episode. Today we have with us Dr. Sushma V. Murthy, who is an associate professor at the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Christ Deemed to University, Bangalore Central Campus. She is also a part of the Inclusivity Cell at the Department of English and Cultural Studies. This episode is a candid conversation where we talk about some of the most important issues in the society which we feel is internalized misogyny and gender equality. So keep listening to GirlUp Mukti Podcast and hope you enjoy the show. Let's get started. Good afternoon, ma'am. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm good. How are you, Toshank?
Really good. First of all, thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to the podcast. So, ma'am, we talk about feminism and gender and sex at in this time, and I feel that the youth needs to be educated before they get into feminism and try to understand it. So, could you please just tell the viewers how exactly sex, gender, and feminism is different and how they're related?
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity anyway, and good afternoon to all the listeners. So I will just tell you how I came to feminism to begin with, right? So I lived in a family where my father used to play very unconventional roles as a man, as a husband, as a father, and that would sometimes fascinate me, sometimes irritate me. And my mother would get worked up sometimes because my father would end up folding clothes or washing the vessels for her. And at one point of time, I remember asking my dad, don't you feel, troubled by this? Or why do you have to do this? Can't mom do this? He said, no, this is work and work is not gendered.
Yeah.
So, and I would like to pitch in. And I can say that some of the most delicious dishes I have ever tasted were prepared by my dad. So I already had somebody at home who was very, diverse in the understanding of identity itself. Because he did not classify himself as a man who was performing a set of designated tasks, right? And I remember when we were children, he used to bathe us. He also took care of his mother and his younger siblings when they were born, because it was a huge family of 10 to 13 children. I mean, almost 3 children my grandmother lost, right? I mean, at the time of birth. So there were 10 of them, and my dad was the eldest. And when my dad was born, he was called Gundu Rao. He was called Gunda. Gunda in Kannada means, a stone, right?
Oh, okay.
So they said, okay, let him be like a stone, let him survive. And later we will name him, right? So he came from a space where he would make some 50 chapatis per day for the family. He would bathe the young babies, take care of his mother.
How big was the family?
The family was about 10 children, and there were other relatives too. It was a huge joint family. Right. So, I mean, I come from that background. And then when I came into literature, I had a professor who was a feminist. And you could say that the 3 important people who led me to feminism were all men. One was my father, the other one was my maternal grandfather, and the third one was my, professor who was also my PhD guide. And, and that is the reason why when I came to feminism, I did not come with this idea that a feminist is a man-hater or that a feminist is somebody who looks at only women's issues. And when I was doing my research, I had a friend who asked me this very pertinent question. She said, Sushma, if we go on talking about women, right, when it comes to gender, don't you think we are leaving the men behind, she asked. And I gave a very, very academic, typical feminist response, because I came from Western feminism, because most of my feminism came through Siksu or Boer or some of these Western cisgendered white feminists, right? So, of course, Siksu was not cisgendered in that sense. But then the whole idea of gender was taught to me in terms of white heteronormative feminism, right? But then as I moved into my research was on a lesbian feminist writer. And then also I had an identity crisis in the sense that I was myself, I'm cisgendered, I'm heteronormative, but then I was working on a lesbian writer, and I found it very difficult to come to terms with that, because a lot of people ask me, how could you talk about a lesbian experience? And that is when I realized that there is a textuality to gender, there is an experience, and there is a process of identification, and there is a lesbian text there, and there is a whole project of inclusivity that we need to bring into our feminism, no matter what our personal orientations. And that is when I started looking at the whole politics of what is sex and what is gender, because for the longest time we have looked at only gender and we have not looked at sex.
True.
What is important for us to realize is that even sex is constructed, or it is conditioned to be, male or female. It is biologically determined. It is not biological, right? So I always give this example. If we see a tree with leaves, with long pointed leaves, we don't call it male. If we see a tree with rounded, curved leaves, we don't call it female, right? There is just matter, there is materiality, right? And when a child is born, there are certain characteristics which are distinct, unique to each body, right? But the materiality of the body in itself, for example, the genitalia, which becomes the basis for the assignment of sex, is just matter, it's biological matter. And what happens largely is we tend to associate a sex to that body because we see it as male.
Yeah.
Right? And male and female are not the beginning of identity.
Yeah.
Rather, they are reinforcements of gender. And because we need to live in a society where we need to perpetuate and maintain the binary between what is masculine and feminine, and we need to have a society that is heteronormative largely, we perpetuate sex. So sex, you could say, is a narrative that is based on gender. Rather than looking at gender as something that is flowing from sex or following from sex, we need to look at sex and gender as interrelated concepts which reinforce each other, right? And then coming on to sexuality, I think sexuality is more, you could say, a worldview, a process of being, a kind of performance with which you interact with the world or identify with the world. It is not just about one intimate act with another person, how it is understood. So, for example, my choice of colors, the food I eat, right, what I find beautiful or aesthetic, right, the way in which I interact with the world symbolically, for example, the literature I like, the films I watch, all of them have to do with my sexuality, right? And that is the reason why sexuality needs to be opened up, discourses of sexuality need to be opened up, because sexuality is just one aspect of your identity, and it is completely tied up with both sex and gender, right? So to quote a very popular theorist, Michel Foucault, he says sexuality is historical, right? So depending on the time or historical space in which you were born and you grew up or you relocated, right, your sexuality was influenced by all of those elements, right? So it's very important for us to look at gender, therefore, in terms of all of these conditions of identity. I would call these as processes of embodiment. So you have biology, and then you have society, and you have the cultural interactionism between biology and society to a larger extent, right? And you have your popular culture narratives, you have your, imaginary space of gender, right? So your gender is a whole lot of complexities between all of these different interactions.
Ma'am, don't you think like these boundaries are somewhere the main root cause how our mentalities are being set?
Exactly.
And I think personally the boundaries which are there, I just feel that they're baseless in some of the ways. Like you mentioned, the state, till now we don't have a solid rule for LGBTQ community. Although they have taken a step as per them, that they have started including them in the sections when we have to fill our gender, but still, if I take a example of a normal household, and if a person opens up about their sexuality, the parents, they won't accept it, and even though they try to accept it, they'll always think that Indian society will never accept them. You just go outside and do whatever you want to do, because outside India everything is fine. Don't you think that is the problem?
Okay, see, I would look at it more in terms of ideology,
Okay.
right? see, whether you see the state or the law or religion or something else restricting your boundaries and conditioning your gender behaviors into something normative, it is largely based on an ideological understanding of the fixity of both sex and gender. More gender inclusive pronouns, or in terms of opening up our imaginary, right? It could be film, it could be literature, it could be popular representations of gender fluidity. To a large extent, that kind of censorship also prevents us from narrativizing the body, right? So I think the most important thing for us to do is for us to look at the body itself, right? Because we are not ready to talk about the body.
Yeah.
Right?
True.
There is absolutely no language for the body outside of popular discourse, number one. Number two, there is a great deal of censorship around the body in terms of how we imagine the body. Of course, there's a lot that we need to do in terms of gender awareness and reaching out. But I think the first most important thing that we need to do is to address what we call as epistemic violence. And what we mean by epistemology is knowledge systems that are in place, right? So you have a certain understanding of, say, for example, let's take a cisgendered woman. So a cisgendered woman is somebody whose gender is in agreement with her biological sex, which means that she identifies that her sex and gender are very easily accommodated within each other, and they flow into each other, right? So there is no crisis of biology versus culture or biology versus social practice or embodiment there. Okay, so the idea that, for example, a lot of men historically looked at women taking up jobs or women being in top positions, even to this day, you see that, right? They see that as a threat, right? And there is so much of hatred against women. So what we commonly identify as misogyny, right? And misogyny, which used to be previously very subtle form of sexism, and sexism was the more overt form of hatred, right? But you see that the definition has changed now to include misogyny also includes prejudice against women, hatred against women, violence against women, right? And misogyny today also includes transphobia, homophobia, which means that you are not just looking at the cisgendered woman, you are looking at any kind of performance of femininity as a threat. So, for example, you see men who are spurned by women whom they have professed love to, and and there are acid attacks, right? There is, generally you hate women. So you have this, very interesting, idea of celibacy, right? That is based on hatred of women, right? It's very interesting to see how sometimes when you see your WhatsApp jokes, when you see popular media, there are jokes about women, there are jokes about wives, there are jokes about mothers, there are jokes about blonde women, right? You laugh at women, you laugh at the amount of time they take to make up, right? Or that they can't be good drivers, and when they can't find their ATM cards in their huge bags, right? So there are these. I mean, this is what we call as epistemic violence, right?
In this, don't you think somewhere men play a very crucial part, because like you mentioned, WhatsApp group, it's a very basic thing we have in our lifestyle, and we don't think about it as a very serious thing. We always take it as a joke. But the depth of that joke is somewhere, engraved in us. And we never come across any joke which is about men, being like that. But right now, I feel that sometimes it is the other way around. Like, I've seen some cases wherein the feminism, the entire ideology is taken in a very wrong way.
Exactly.
Like, what is your take on that?
Yeah, that is the whole point. See, I'll just give you an example. There are a lot of groups that look at men today, right? But they celebrate a hegemonic masculinity. So hegemonic masculinity is any form of masculinity which has a certain ideal way of being a man or a male or a boy, okay? And that differs from culture to culture. But there are few things that are very common to hegemonic masculinities. One is toxic masculinity, right? The other one is the institutionalized form of violence. So, for example, rape, right, is a larger problem than just, physical violence or violation of a woman. There is a larger
extreme degree of that.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, when you talk to men, right, or when you look at, say, child sexual abuse, it is not about pleasure. It is more about asserting one's masculinity in a very violent way. And we have cultures, societies, ideologies, narratives, practices which reassert or reaffirm this kind of toxic masculinity as hegemonic masculinity and as institutionalized violence, that men have to be aggressive, right? And a lot of misogyny stems from this kind of aggressiveness. And a lot of hatred of men comes from, like you said, a very misplaced sense of feminism, right? Which looks at patriarchy as just men. But patriarchy is not men, because men are equally conditioned by patriarchal ideology. And that is the reason why I talk about hegemonic masculinity, because men are conditioned to perform their masculinity in a particular way, right? Which means that men also, are part of these institutions. They perform social roles as men, right? And men are highly institutionalized, which means that they are not just upholding their self, right? But they also uphold certain institutions, right? So when a man does not marry, it is about not just him not marrying, but it's about the procreation of his entire species. It is about continuing his lineage,
yes.
right? It is about upholding certain traditions and practices. So you always see that when you are a father, it is very different from being a mother.
And ma'am,
right?
in that I have also come across certain problems wherein the man is thought about, he's a very incapable of being a man when he's not marrying or when he's not
Exactly.
able to
Yeah.
conceive.
Yeah.
Then they are looked upon like, he's a very
you are
weak.
literally emasculated, right? Yeah. Now this happens even at a point of time when you don't show your masculinity very aggressively, right?
So, I mean, that one question I had. So, like, where do we put the line in toxic masculinity and normalizing it?
Okay. See, this is something I had to tell you much earlier. See, the idea here is that we are all ideologically programmed. There is no escaping from ideology. So we cannot think of a society where there is no male or female or masculinity or femininity. Of course, that will keep changing. All that I'm saying is that we need to be more inclusive. Right? There are different types of masculinities, there are different types of femininities. Now, when it comes to toxic masculinity is seen as very integral to the hegemonic idea of who a man is. Right? And unless that changes, right? The idea of hegemonic masculinity has to change. Right? There will always be a hegemonic masculinity, right? Because that is how ideology works, isn't it? Right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that when we look at, say, you talked about feminism. So in fact, some of the earliest thinkers who have talked about masculinity, of course, the term that is used here is masculinities, because men are always seen as plural, men are always seen as social beings, right? And the register for masculinity is men, whereas the linguistic register for women is woman, right? So there is a singular operational idea of woman which is posited onto all women, whereas with men don't even have individual identities. Men are seen as public beings, they are faces in the crowd, and they are seen as a body of men. And to that extent, I would say we need to look at men as individuals.
They are very in a very generalized way. They are always
exactly right. So even when you look at your metrosexual male, right, that is more of a fashionable catchphrase, and it's more of a practice rather than the norm, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that when we look at gender, right, we need to look at both men and women. We need to look at the different performances of masculinity and femininity. These could be in terms of differential sexuality, this could be in terms of pluralities of gender, this could be in terms of the whole idea of looking at biology itself and questioning that biology. So when you look at a trans body, right, it could be either performing gender differently, or it could be based on sex change, I'm talking about the body itself, or it could be based on cross-dressing. Right? So it could be a transvestite body, it could be a transsexual body, or it could be a transgender body, or it could be a combination of all these factors, and add to that the complexity of sexuality, right? Because sexuality, even when you are looking at a trans body, is not, definitely non-binary, right? So when we talk about gender, whether it is equity, equality, right, we need to look at these, what we call as the intersectionalities of gender, right? And the most important thing is, instead of classifying women and men, right, into a certain set of ideas, characteristics, into a set of practices, bodily practices, social practices. We need to open up to the fact that there can be no feminism without discussion of men, on men, including men, right? And multiple, performances of femininity and masculinity, right? So today, when we talk about feminism, right? I mean, in fact, feminism used to be almost like an insult, right? That you are a feminist. If you would say, even to this day, sometimes you say you're a feminist, people will think that you hate men, right? So we have that old image of the bra burning kind of second wave feminist, right? But the idea that I'm trying to bring here is that feminism is not just about women. It's also about the different pluralities and diversities of gender, and also the intersectionalities of gender. What I mean by that is, for example, when we say misogyny, right? You know that there is a term that is coined called misogyny, right? Because it is about misogyny against black women, right? Misogyny, right? So you look at the intersectionalities of caste, of religion, okay, of ethnicity, of race, of disability. All these are very important questions for feminism today, right? And this is something that goes across queer. And that is why we look at the term queer diaspora today, right? Queer itself has a diasporic experience. And if you were to ask me what is queer, I would give you Halperin's definition, which is queer is anything that goes against the norm, right? So which means that pretty much all of us are queer, right? And this idea of the queer allows us to look at the fluidity and multiplicity of gender and not classify gender and gender questions as either masculine or related to women, and masculine related to men and feminine related to women, which is what we have been doing for a long time, right? So I feel that there is a lot of everyday sexism, whether it is homophobia, transphobia, misogyny against women, right? And there is a lot of this, what we call as epistemic violence, and we are not even aware of it. We think that it's very normal to joke about these things. We think that it's very okay to laugh at certain jokes, so there is so much of the performativity of gender, which is something that is normative, right? That we have to stop and look at the performance of gender, right? Which means that there is a very specific historicity, there is a very specific context to how I perform my gender, right? And I'm not just a woman. When I'm a woman, I'm a lot of things at the same time. I belong to a certain class, a certain caste, a certain religion, a certain linguistic identity. I belong to Bangalore, which makes me very urban. I'm educated. I'm one of the few women who is privileged to be educated, right? I'm a Bangalorean. I just spoke to somebody before coming in here, right? So a person might not have been born in Bangalore, but you've lived in Bangalore for 25 years. You become a Bangalorean, right? And that is a very, very distinct identity.
So, ma'am, so like you mentioned, you are from Bangalore, and like how you have been privileged enough to be educated, and how you have been, able to come up and present yourself in a very dignified way. So, do you think internalized misogyny is very well present in the workplaces?
Definitely, definitely. Yes.
So, like, is there any personal experience you have faced?
Okay. So I have not really had any direct experience of misogyny. I'm fortunate enough to work in a place where I have not found my gender to be something that will be, used against me, or I have not really felt oppressed, right? But sometimes I see that in sexist language. That's why I said everyday sexism in the language that is used, and sometimes it is more of a perception. It is not only internalized by men, it is also internalized by women.
Yes.
Right? Exactly. So sometimes your marital status, sometimes, people assume, for example, I've gotten used to it actually. So a lot of people call me Mrs. Murthy, right? Actually, Murthy is my dad's name. So sometimes I very jokingly tell them I'm not married to my dad, right? So I have to every time qualify that I'm not married. And in fact, I am more, you could say, appropriated by the institution of marriage than all the married women around me, sorry, because I will have to constantly qualify my status as single, right? So I see misogyny in very, very covert ways, sometimes coming from women, right? I mean, sometimes your bodily practices or your perceptions of who this person is. For example, they assume that because I'm in my 40s, I have children, right?
Exactly.
And the first question is, what do your children
That perception.
do, right?
Yeah.
So I find these kinds of everyday sexism, but I really do not see any overt sexism in the form of either a disparity in opportunities or disparity in say wages, right, which is very prevalent. So if you look at the sports scene or if you look at the political scene, see the gender disparity is so very blatantly out there, right? So you look at your male cricketers and how much they earn, and look at the female cricket team, right? The women's cricket team rather. Yeah. So you see that it's very blatantly out there. And if you look at the Forbes list, there are not even, I think, maybe about 51 women on the Forbes list, and look at the men there, right? Yes. So that kind of disparity I have not ever faced in the workplace. I have been fortunate, you could say, but then everyday sexism is something that I encounter, right? And
ma'am, just to conclude the entire podcast, is there any message you want to give to the youth? Because in GirlUp Mukti, we always aim to bring a change, and and we always aim through the podcast. So all the people who are listening to us, somehow they are able to make a change, and they get influenced by the talks which we have in our podcast. So, is there any message you want to give to the youth?
Yeah, see, I feel that we need to look at the larger picture. See, for example, when I see a lot of violence against women, we look at that merely from the perpetrator-victim position, for example. So for me, one of my students introduced this book to me. It's called The South of Forgiveness. Okay. It's about this girl, this woman who is married, she has children, and she goes back to her, she travels down south to meet her boyfriend who had raped her, right? To understand what it was that triggered him to rape her at that point of time, which led to the breakup later. So, for me, this dialogue is very important, right? When you look at gender, look at it from a dialogic perspective, to borrow a phrase from Mikhail Bakhtin, right? He uses the term dialogic, right? Which means that gender needs to be a conversation, right? So if you're going to talk about women's rights, you need to involve men, right? If you're going to talk about feminism or masculinities, you need to look at the different, registers of identity. You need to look across the gender spectrum, right? And you also need to have the intersectionality of gender in mind, because you need to look at what is the specific context, class, caste, ability, urban or rural, regional, local, global, right? Is this an immigrant? So, for example, you look at the hijab controversy. What is happening in Iran is very different from what happened in Karnataka. Exactly. So the registers are very different. Yes. So very often I see a lot of people reacting to violence without looking at the larger picture, right? So something as simple as abuse of women, sexual abuse of women, needs to be looked at from the register of masculinities. And you need to understand why there are so many rapes, why there is so much of child sexual abuse, and you need to look at the larger ideological, basis of this kind of a performance of masculinity. Unless you address that, if you change the laws, if you bring in, reforms, or if you give death sentence, right, or you take up some, punitive measures that are extremely violent towards the man. Right, you are just punishing the criminal, you are not looking at crime. Yes. And I think we need to move from criminal systems to justice systems, where we look at, we need to acknowledge the role of media, the role of society, the role of ideology largely, right, in how masculinity is performed or how femininity is performed. Yes. And we need to locate our politics of gender within this dialogic, intersectional, inclusive, diverse space. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. It was a wonderful, opportunity, and thank you for giving me the space to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart. Thank you
so much.
So that's it for today's podcast.
Hope you all enjoyed the show.
But wait, stay tuned for our next episode, which will be out soon. Till then, stay safe and keep calm.
The podcasts are available on your favorite streaming apps, including Spotify and YouTube.